If you're a man who feels like the system is actively working against you, that every institution from the IRS to the family courts is basically designed to extract your hard-earned wealth, then today's deep dive is your war manual.
It really is. I mean, it's a profound and frankly just a completely unapologetic reframing of human history. We are looking at this financial and psychological architecture that spans thousands of years.
Yeah, it completely upends how we are taught to view our relationship with the state.
Absolutely.
And before we get into the trenches of this incredibly intense material, I want to make sure you never miss out on these explorations. So if you want to keep getting these deep dives, please like and subscribe to the show right now.
It really is the best way to support what we do.
Right? And also, I need to make it explicitly clear right up front that today's deep dive is an ebook review. The material we're covering is absolutely fascinating, ultra long, and, incredibly incisive.
Very much so.
You can, and honestly you should, go buy this book right now on Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books. It is a massive read that really demands your attention. And you should also go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, the book in question is Conrad Riker's 2025 release, The History and Power of Taxation.
Such a heavy title.
It is, yeah. And the mission of this deep dive is to unpack Riker's incendiary premise, because he argues that taxation is not some civic duty.
Right.
It's not a necessary evil to pave roads and build schools. He says it's rather a 5,000-year-old system of violence and psychological warfare.
And specifically, this is key, he views it as a system designed to neuter male productivity.
Exactly, to neuter male productivity and fund institutions that have been captured by what he describes as feminists, Marxists, and bureaucratic elites.
Now, before we go a single step further, we have to lay down a crucial disclaimer. We are diving into heavily politically charged content today.
Very charged.
Yeah. Riker is writing specifically for a men's rights and red-pilled manosphere audience. So hear us clearly on this. We are not taking any sides here.
No sides at all.
We aren't endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our job today is to impartially report on Riker's fascinating historical arguments and convey the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material so you can decide for yourself.
Precisely. Our goal is just to map out the territory Riker has charted.
Yeah.
We want to understand the mechanics of how he connects these historical dots from, ancient empires all the way to the modern family court system.
Yeah, and to examine the underlying logic of his arguments. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because we aren't starting with the IRS.
No, not at all.
We aren't even starting with the British Empire or the Romans. To understand modern institutional capture, the author argues we actually have to look at how the earliest human societies learned to extort productivity.
Right, we're going all the way back to the forests, looking at hunter-gatherer societies.
Which immediately challenges that whole textbook narrative we all learned in grade school, right?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Because when we think of early human tribes, we generally default to this romanticized view of communal living.
Like a primitive utopia.
Exactly. We picture resources being shared voluntarily for the good of the group. But Riker draws heavily on the research of anthropologist Christopher Bohm, specifically looking at the Mbengela tribes in Central Africa, to completely shatter that illusion.
Yeah, the sharing meat part.
Right. He points out that sharing meat wasn't some beautiful voluntary act of primitive communism. It was enforced through a highly coordinated system of social blackmail.
Which makes sense when you think about the mechanics of a hunt. It requires massive caloric expenditure, right? Mostly by the men of the tribe.
Yeah, hunter goes out, risks his life, burns thousands of calories, and brings down an animal.
And the natural instinct, just from a purely biological standpoint, would be to secure that caloric surplus for himself and his immediate offspring.
Of course it would.
But if he tried to keep that meat, he didn't just get a stern talking to from the elders.
No, the mechanism of extraction was far more insidious than that. If a hunter tried to hoard his kill, he faced orchestrated gossip campaigns designed to isolate him.
Wow.
And crucially, he faced exclusion from mating networks. The tribal hierarchy essentially dictated that the alpha male got the first pick of the most nutrient-dense meat, followed by the shamans, and then it trickled down to everyone else.
So the hunter who actually performed the labor was essentially taxed on his caloric output.
Exactly. He was taxed on his sweat.
And if he refused, it wasn't just a fun, The author paints a really vivid picture of the physical reality of the system. He talks about waking up with spear points at your throat while the tribe cants about angry forest spirits.
Yeah, it was extraction backed by the absolute threat of lethal violence.
But veiled in spiritual necessity.
What's fascinating here is that this establishes the primal blueprint for all future taxation. It introduces Riker's trinity of tyrannical power.
Fear, guilt, and bureaucracy.
Right. The leaders of the tribe, the alpha acting as the state, and the shamans acting as the ideological enforcers, they didn't just physically take the meat.
Because that would be mere theft.
Exactly, and theft breeds immediate rebellion. Instead, they frame the extraction as a moral necessity for the survival of the group, a way to appease the spirits and ensure future hunts.
So this is the establishment of the very first social contracts, according to Riker.
Yes, and he views every single social contract since as a variation of this original scam.
It's psychological warfare from day one. You aren't being robbed, you are fulfilling your duty to the cosmos.
Beautifully put.
And as human societies scale up from tribes to empires, the extortion just scales with them. The book moves from the African forests over to Mesoamerica, specifically focusing on the Aztecs.
And the data he pulls here is just staggering.
It really is. He brings up archaeological discoveries from 2018 that unearth these 3,000-year-old tax ledgers. The conquered cities under Aztec rule were paying 980,000 cocoa beans annually to the capital.
To put that in perspective, we are talking about roughly 11 tons of cocoa beans every single year.
11 tons.
Yeah, and in the Aztec economy, cocoa beans weren't just food, they were a fiat currency and heavy stimulant. 11 tons is enough to brew 2 million psychoactive drinks.
That is wild.
And those drinks were used to literally fuel the priests and the warrior caste who were managing the empire and collecting the taxes.
I love the linguistic connection he makes here, by the way. Explain the word they used for the tax collectors, because I think it tells you everything you need to know about how the populace viewed them.
Oh, it's perfect. The Aztec word for tax collector was cacahuatl,
Which means?
which translates literally to bitter cocoa man.
Bitter cocoa man!
Yeah, it perfectly encapsulates the resentment of the populace. They were running a massive caffeine-fueled extraction machine across thousands of miles.
And without the use of wheeled vehicles, right? Or beasts of burden.
Right, human porters carried these massive tax burdens on their backs to the capital.
But it wasn't just beans and textiles. The author details how the Aztecs combined this economic taxation with the ultimate physical taxation
Yes, human sacrifice.
on an industrial scale. We are talking about 20,000 hearts torn out annually to pay their sun god, Huitzilopochtli.
And this is where Riker's analysis of the mechanism of power comes in. Because the traditional historical view is that the Aztecs were merely highly religious zealots,
Like they believed the sun would physically stop moving if it wasn't fed blood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Riker argues this was not mere religious fervor. It was the ultimate display of state power over the individual's life and labor.
By demanding the ultimate sacrifice, the lives of the conquered youths, the state demonstrated that it owned everything.
Right, it owned your crops, your labor, and your heartbeat. Terror was the foundational currency.
Because if you can convince a population to hand over their children to a priest with an obsidian knife, collecting a tax on their corn is trivial?
Trivial. It's a rounding error at that point.
That brings us to Egypt, which really illuminated the sheer, calculating bureaucracy of early empires for me. The pharaohs used these massive stone structures called nilometers.
Right, nilometers.
Now, if you go to a museum today or read a standard history textbook, the nilometer is usually described as this benevolent early agricultural tool.
Yeah, a way to measure the flooding of the Nile River so the administration could predict harvest yields.
Exactly, to manage food supplies and help the people survive lean years.
But Riker completely rejects that benevolent interpretation. He examines the actual bureaucratic mechanism of how the nilometer was used.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, the Egyptian economy relied entirely on the annual flooding of the Nile, which deposited nutrient-rich silt onto the farmland. The nilometer was a gauge built into the river, marked in cubits.
Like a giant ruler in the water.
Exactly. And Riker points out that the pharaohs didn't use this to distribute aid. They used it to calculate the absolute maximum mathematical extraction they could force on the peasant farmers before triggering mass starvation and revolt.
Let's walk through that math, because it's chilling when you think about it. The state would read the gauge. Let's say it's a poor flood year, measuring 14 cubits.
Right.
The state calculates that this will yield exactly enough grain to keep the peasants alive, plus a little surplus. The tax rate is set at 60% of that yield.
Yes.
But what happens if it's a bumper crop? What if the Nile floods perfectly to 20 cubits, meaning the harvest will be massive?
The state doesn't say, great, The peasants get to keep the extra and build wealth.
No.
The state recalibrates the baseline. They still take 60% of the newly increased total.
So they just move the goalposts.
Exactly. It was a tool of calibration for the state's greed, like an early analog algorithm for maximizing extraction. The state absorbed all the upside of a good year, while the peasant absorbed all the labor.
Riker's broader point is that rulers learned exactly how far they could push a population.
And the Inca Empire in South America executed a very similar calculus with their Mida system.
Oh yeah, because they didn't have currency.
Right. They didn't have money, so they taxed time and physical labor.
Right.
It was a mandatory 66-day annual labor tax imposed on every able-bodied male.
66 days a year just for the state.
Yeah. This is how infrastructure like the roads of the Andes and the stones of Machu Picchu were actually constructed.
And how did they enforce a 66-day labor tax on a guy living halfway up a mountain?
Yeah.
You can't just garnish his wages.
No, they used human leverage. If you missed your quota or refused to work your 66 days, your children became collateral.
Wow.
The state would take them for the sacrificial altars, the Capacocha rituals. Riker calls it a highly effective, albeit brutal, mechanism of human resource management.
You tie the physical survival of a man's lineage to his willingness to perform unpaid labor for the state.
Precisely.
Here is what I struggle to wrap my head around, though. I look at the Egyptian nilometer, or the Inca Mida system, and it feels exactly like a rigged casino game. The house, the pharaoh, the emperor always knows exactly how much it can bleed you. They know the exact mathematical point where you will physically drop dead or walk away from the table.
Yeah, they have it calculated to the decimal.
Right. The mechanism is so overtly hostile to the individual. So how did early rulers convince entire populations of millions of people that this was just, normal? Why didn't the Egyptian farmers just smash the nilometer?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that question brings us perfectly to the second leg of Riker's trinity, guilt.
Guilt.
Brute force has limitations. Fear of sacrificial knives works, sure, but it's really expensive to maintain armies to enforce it constantly.
Right. You need a guy with a spear on every corner.
Exactly. So once institutions needed to manage millions of people across vast geographies, they had to weaponize guilt. They weaponized religion and morality to ensure compliance at a psychological level. This is the historical transition from brute force to ideological capture. You don't need a soldier at every farm if you could put a tax collector inside the farmer's own mind.
Spiritual protection rackets.
Precisely. Riker argues that historical spiritual leadership functioned almost identically to a mafia protection racket, just with much better architecture and public relations.
Like the medieval church in Europe.
Let's look at the medieval church. They implemented the tithe, a mandatory 10% tax on all agricultural produce. To manage this massive influx of physical goods, they built these huge fireproof structures called tithe barns.
God's warehouses.
They were literally referred to as God's warehouses.
And the beauty of this system, from the state's perspective, is that if your crop failed and you couldn't pay the tithe, you weren't just a criminal.
No, you were a sinner.
You were a sinner. You were risking eternal damnation. But of course, the people writing the rules built in mechanisms to protect their own wealth.
They always do.
The author dives into the biblical text itself, citing Numbers 18.26 to show how deep the bureaucracy goes. He points out that the Levite priests, who were the ones collecting the tithes from the Israelites, had specific exemptions baked into the religious law.
Right, allowing their extended families and cousins to avoid the heaviest burdens of tithing.
Nepotism was greasing the gears of the tax machine from the very beginning.
And as the centuries progressed, the disparity between the taxpayers and the tax collectors became visually staggering. Riker uses the example of Wittenberg, Germany, in 1517.
Okay, set the scene for us.
You have a situation where the local peasant population is dealing with famine. I mean, they are quite literally starving in the mud. Meanwhile, the local Catholic bishop, who is funded almost entirely by local taxes and the sale of indulgences, is commissioning lavish banquets.
The swan-shaped pork roast, this detail is incredible.
That's absurd.
The author notes that the bishop's banquets featured these massive meat sculptures, specifically pork roasted and molded into the shape of a giant swan.
Right.
It was a culinary flex that required 12 servants just to rotate the spit over the fire. Think about the caloric and economic waste being flaunted in front of starving taxpayers.
It was the sheer audacity of this extraction that finally broke the psychological spell for some. Riker frames Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses, which he nailed to the church door in Wittenberg that same year. not just as a lofty theological dispute about salvation,
Right, but as what?
as the 16th century equivalent of leaving a scathing one-star Yelp review for a corrupt, monopolistic corporation.
I love that comparison because the church wasn't just taxing the harvest anymore, they were taxing the afterlife.
Yes, selling indulgence.
They were selling indulgences, and the mechanism here is brilliant in its evil. The church created a concept called purgatory, a place of suffering between heaven and hell. Then, they claimed, they had a treasury of merit, essentially a bank account of extra goodness generated by the saints. They would sell you a certificate, an indulgence, that transferred some of that goodness to your dead relatives to get them out of purgatory faster.
They literally priced out time in the afterlife.
It was the ultimate monetization of guilt. The wealthy could essentially buy their way out of the consequences of their actions, funding the bureaucracy in the process.
But Riker doesn't just treat this as a quirk of medieval history. He draws a direct, unbroken line from the tithe barns of 1517 to modern megachurches and eventually to the secular state itself.
So, skipping forward to the 20th century.
Right. He points to the televangelism boom. Look at Oral Roberts in 1987.
Oh man, this story.
He went on television and demanded $8 million from his followers, claiming that God would call him home, meaning execute him, if he didn't hit his fundraising goal by March.
It's a hostage situation. He took himself hostage to extort his audience.
It really was.
And the mechanics of this haven't disappeared in the 21st century. The author looks at modern megachurches where 12% of massive, multi-million-dollar budgets are frequently allocated to housing allowances for the leadership.
Right, building pastoral McMansions with 17 bathrooms.
He brings up a wild leak from 2019 regarding a Mormon tithing app. The church was using software to actively categorize its members based on their financial compliance.
That was a crazy story.
If you paid your sole 10% of your gross income, the app labeled you as celestial. If you fell short, you were labeled telestial, which effectively meant you were a financial apostate, unworthy of the highest tier of heaven.
It gamifies spiritual salvation. They're using the psychological mechanics of a freemium video game, locking the best rewards behind a paywall to extract real-world wealth.
Wow.
Riker even cites a recent case where a Florida pastor sued his own congregation for $3 million.
Sued his own flock.
Yes. The flock had discovered he used their tithes money to buy a Lamborghini, which he justified as necessary to spread the gospel on wheels.
You can't make this stuff up.
When they rebelled and stopped paying, he utilized the secular legal system to try and force them to continue funding his lifestyle. Riker's historical through line here is undeniable. The faithful always pay twice.
First, with the sweat of their physical labor, and second, with the psychological burden of their manufactured guilt.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because Riker makes a pivot here that I think is the linchpin of his entire thesis. He talks about these 14th century Dominican ledgers, where the church literally priced out specific sins. It was a fee schedule for morality. Adultery cost 6 gold coins. Murder was priced at roughly a year's wages.
And stealing communion wine from the altar was considered priceless and resulted in immediate excommunication.
You look at that mechanism, paying a fee to an administrative body to cleanse yourself of moral failing, and it is the exact same mechanism as modern carbon credits or corporate ESG scores.
This raises an important question about how we view the modern state. Riker's argument is that the secular state has not abolished religion. It has simply replaced the church as the ultimate arbiter of morality and guilt.
So the state is the new church.
Yes. If you are a corporation and you commit a supposed sin against the environment by emitting carbon, or a sin against social justice by lacking the right diversity metrics, you don't go to confession.
You buy a carbon offset.
Exactly. You pay a financial fee to a consulting firm or a government bureaucracy. The mechanism of using moral guilt to extract wealth is identical to the Dominican ledgers. Only the vestments have changed.
The priests are now wearing business suits and holding clipboards.
Exactly.
And this transition from religious guilt to secular bureaucratic extraction leads us directly into the core of the book. We're moving into how this massive, hungry system focuses its crosshairs today.
Right.
The author argues that modern institutions systematically and intentionally target male wealth and productivity. And he starts by looking at a fascinating piece of legal history, the 1724 bachelor tax in colonial Virginia.
This is a perfect example of the state using the tax code for social engineering. In 1724, Virginia implemented a law stating that any unmarried man over the age of 21 was subject to an annual 20-shilling fee.
Just for being single.
Just for being a bachelor. Why? Because an independent, unmarried man is mobile. He is difficult to track, difficult to control, and he keeps his wealth to himself.
So Riker frames this early tax as the state actively punishing male independence.
Yes, it was a financial penalty designed to force men to take on the yoke of a family unit. Because once a man has a wife and children, he is tied to a specific piece of geography.
He needs stability.
Right. He becomes, in the eyes of the state, a predictable, reliable node of taxable revenue.
The state essentially said, your labor belongs to the community, and if you refuse to channel it through a state-sanctioned marriage, we will just take the money directly.
Exactly.
And Riker tracks that animus, that fundamental belief that male productivity is a public utility, straight into the modern family court system. He provides several case studies that are, frankly, brutal to read.
Very difficult.
He interviews a Texas oil rig worker he calls Joe. Joe works grueling, physically dangerous shifts, 14 days on, 14 days off, and loses 40% of his gross paycheck to alimony to a woman he hasn't lived with in a decade.
He also highlights the case of Mark Renard, a tech executive. Renard is court-ordered to pay $1.2 million annually into his ex-wife's trust fund.
$1 million, wow.
And the detail Riker emphasizes is that Renard's ex-wife now lives in their former marital mansion with her new boyfriend, who happens to be a part-time MMA instructor.
Naturally.
Right, and because the boyfriend isn't legally married to her, and the wealth transfer is categorized as alimony to the ex-wife, that new household is essentially subsidized by Renard's labor.
Renard has a quote in the book that summarizes the entire mechanic. The government taxed my income twice, once when I earned it and again when she spent it, and the author calls modern alimony equality through double taxation.
Yeah.
But what really blew my mind was the legislative history here. Riker points to a specific policy shift that most people completely ignored, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Yes, the TCJA fundamentally altered the mathematical reality of divorce for men. Let's break down how that mechanism used to work versus how it works now.
Let's do it.
Historically, alimony payments were tax deductible for the person paying them, which was overwhelmingly the male earner. The person receiving the alimony paid the income tax on it.
Right.
Riker argues this older system was at least a tacit acknowledgement by the state that the man should not be penalized for money he no longer possessed.
But the 2017 reform retroactively removed that deduction for the payer.
Exactly. The government realized they were losing revenue because the alimony recipient was usually in a lower tax bracket than the payer.
Ah, so they wanted the higher tax rate.
Right. By removing the deduction, the state forced the higher-earning male to pay taxes at his highest marginal bracket on income that is immediately garnished and handed to his ex-spouse.
And the ex-spouse now receives that money completely tax-free.
The state successfully shifted the tax burden to capture maximum revenue. Riker notes that this single legislative pen stroke turned 2.3 million existing divorce decrees into fiscal time bombs, devastating the net incomes of obligated men overnight.
It's wild math when you actually sit down and calculate it. And Riker lays out the broader macroeconomic statistics to support his point about extraction.
Right.
In the United States, men pay 82% of all income taxes. Yet, men comprise 93% of workplace fatalities.
It's a huge disparity.
The state relies entirely on male labor to fund its operations, while men absorb almost all of the physical risk. And to tie it back to the family courts, he pulls data from OSHA showing that divorced men take 23% more hazardous jobs than married men.
The mechanism there is completely clear. Because of the heavy garnishments from alimony and child support, divorced men can no longer survive on standard salaries.
They just don't have enough take-home pay.
Right. They are mathematically forced to seek out high-risk, high-yield employment, working on oil derricks, deep-sea fishing, high-voltage line repair, just to keep their heads above water.
So they're literally risking their lives at a mathematically higher rate just to keep up with state-mandated extraction.
Exactly.
Let's dive deep into the child support system, because the author flat out labels it a state-run racket. Let's look at the margin call analogy he uses.
This is a great analogy.
Let's say you're trading stocks on margin and the market drops. The broker doesn't care about your circumstances, right? They issue a margin call and liquidate your assets to cover the baseline debt.
Right.
Riker argues the child support system operates the exact same way. If a man loses his job or takes a pay cut, the baseline debt of the support order does not automatically adjust.
No, the state continues to charge him based on his previous earning capacity, creating insurmountable arrears.
Riker breaks down the math for a theoretical man earning $50,000 a year who is ordered to pay 30% of his gross income in child support. $15,000 comes right off the top.
Yeah.
Because of how state and federal taxes stack on top of that gross garnishment, the man is left with a fraction of his earnings.
And if that man wants to net just $10,000 extra in his pocket, maybe to save for a new apartment or buy a reliable car to get to work, he can't just earn $10,000.
Because of the taxes.
Because every new dollar is subject to both the tax bracket and the child support percentage. He has to gross an additional $22,222.
The state makes it mathematically impossible to recover. The harder you work, the more aggressively you are penalized.
Exactly. And because the recipient gets that child support money completely tax-free,
Yeah.
there is zero incentive for the receiving household to modify the arrangement.
Right. Riker notes this economic reality results in a 37% drop in remarriage rates for men with support obligations. They simply cannot afford to start a second family.
Which brings us back to the core premise. Riker argues that the state essentially weaponizes the family unit.
Okay, wait, I have to push back here because this is a massive claim.
Go for it.
Riker is drawing a direct comparison between the modern family court system and the Aztec priests demanding human hearts and cocoa beans. Isn't that an incredibly hyperbolic leap? I mean, family courts, whatever their flaws, are ostensibly designed to protect the welfare of children, not appease bloodthirsty sun gods. How does he actually bridge that logical gap without just sounding like an angry guy on the internet?
This raises an important question, and it is a shocking comparison. But Riker defends it by examining the economic output of the system rather than its stated intent.
Okay.
He asks us to look at the bureaucratic mechanism. Riker argues that the family court system is a captured institution. In his view, feminist lobbies and state bureaucrats have aligned to use maternal custody as a vehicle for revenue generation.
Revenue generation for the state.
Right. By defaulting custody to the mother and attaching heavy financial obligations to the father, the state guarantees itself 18 years of predictable, administrable revenue flow.
So in his view, the children are the cocoa beans.
In a sense, yes. In this view, children are no longer just family members. They are transformed into financial instruments.
Wow.
The state uses the father's biological love and moral obligation to his children to turn his labor into what Soviet central planners quite literally called fiscal capillaries.
Fiscal capillaries.
Yes. The state bleeds the man's productivity to fund the massive administrative bloat of the court system, the enforcement agencies, and the welfare programs, all under the unassailable guise of child welfare.
The Aztec priest used the sun god. The modern judge uses the best interest of the child. Riker argues the mechanism of extraction is identical.
Exactly identical.
It is an incredibly dark perspective, but the way he maps the mechanics of the bureaucracy is relentless.
It is.
So we've seen how the state targets income, labor, and family structure. But what happens when people simply stop earning high incomes to avoid the tax?
Well, the state pivots.
Right. If they can't get your income, they will tax your mere existence. This takes us into how governments justify taxing everyday life, proving his point that bureaucracy knows no bounds.
We see this clearly when we look at the history of taxing sunlight and environment. Riker brings up the 1696 British window tax.
Oh, this one is crazy.
At the time, accurately surveying land and assessing property value was administratively difficult. So the Crown decided to use windows as a visible proxy for wealth.
Because more windows equaled a richer owner?
The logic was simple. A bigger house has more windows, therefore the owner is richer. They tied the property tax directly to the number of windows on the structure.
It's perverse logic. If you wanted more sunlight and fresh air in your home, you owed the government more money. And the physiological and economic result was disastrous.
It was. British homeowners, desperate to lower their tax burden, literally bricked up their windows. You can still walk around parts of London and Edinburgh today and see these beautiful historical buildings with blind, bricked-in window frames.
Entire families plunged their homes into darkness and poor ventilation, which contributed to outbreaks of disease just to keep the state from taking our money.
The author calls it state-sponsored vampirism. They literally tax the sun.
And it gets even grosser. Let's talk about 1712 London. The government implemented a urine tax. They put a levy on chamber pots.
The mechanism here is fascinating in its depravity.
Depravity is the right word.
The local tanneries, which processed leather, required massive amounts of ammonia to soften the animal hides. The primary source of ammonia at the time was human urine.
So, a supply chain developed where people collected and sold human waste to the tanneries?
And the bureaucrats looked at this literal trade in human excrement and saw a taxable revenue stream. Riker notes, this wasn't taxation. It was alchemy for sociopaths.
The state will find a way to take a cut of absolutely any transaction, no matter how base.
And this endless search for revenue extends into vice taxes, which Riker argues are humanity's oldest pyramid scheme.
Governments always claim to be moralizing when they tax vice, but the mathematical reality is that they secretly rely on the revenue from the very sins they publicly condemn.
Right, look at King Hammurabi in ancient Babylon around 1792 BCE. He didn't heavily tax Babylonian beer to curb alcoholism or improve public health.
No, he taxed it to fund the maintenance of his temples and his bureaucracy.
It's the moral cover for revenue generation. Riker highlights another brilliant historical example. Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch Director General of New Netherland, which eventually became New York.
Okay, what did he do?
In 1647, Stuyvesant was facing the threat of English invasion and needed to build defensive walls around the city, the wall that eventually gave Wall Street its name.
Ah, Wall Street.
Right. He didn't have the funds, so he heavily taxed the city's brothels. The government stood on a pulpit and moralized about sinful women, while simultaneously pocketing their earnings to build military infrastructure.
The modern parallel Riker draws here is perfectly targeted at his audience. He looks at the explosion of OnlyFans and digital sex work. Independent creators on these platforms are receiving 1099 tax forms from the IRS.
A 1099 is the form used for independent contractors, meaning the state is officially tracking and taxing this income.
Right. The state claims moral superiority, constantly debating the legality and ethics of pornography, but behind the scenes, it aggressively demands its cut of the profits.
He highlights a bizarre, almost comical case of a Florida plumber.
I remember this.
This man tried to claim his Pornhub subscription as a tax-deductible business expense, categorizing it as market research for pipe laying techniques.
That is hilarious.
The IRS, unsurprisingly, denied the deduction. Yet, simultaneously, the UK government is attempting to implement a nationwide system that charges users a $12 annual fee for porn age verification.
I read that and couldn't stop laughing at the absurdity. It's a sin surcharge. But it's actually worse than just a fee. Think about the regulatory capture here.
Right.
The government creates a moral panic about age verification. Then, instead of just enforcing existing laws, they create a new bureaucratic hurdle. And they charge the citizen a fee to jump over the hurdle they just built.
The fee exists entirely to fund the bureaucracy that was created to collect the fee.
It's a self-licking ice cream cone of taxation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Riker is revealing a fundamental truth about state power. Governments don't actually hate your vices. They hate competition.
They hate untaxed commerce.
Exactly. Black markets aren't immoral in the eyes of the state because of the goods being traded. They are immoral because they are unlicensed tax evaders. Vice taxes, therefore, are social control mechanisms disguised as civic virtue.
They allow the state to manage the population's dopamine while skimming the profits.
Beautifully summarized.
And it doesn't stop at vice. Once they tax your income, your family, your sunlight, and your sins, they tax your movement and your time. The author traces the history of taxing commutes, starting with the Roman cursus publicus.
These started as highly efficient military roads designed to move legions quickly across the empire.
But once the infrastructure was laid, the bureaucracy realized it was a perfect choke point. The roads quickly turned into tax arteries. Every merchant, every grain shipment was forced to stop at checkpoints and pay a toll.
And we see that exact mechanism weaponized in the 20th century. Riker points fingers at the 1936 General Motors streetcar conspiracy.
Yes, the streetcars.
General Motors, along with Firestone Tire and Standard Oil, formed front companies, most notably National City Lines. They systematically bought up highly efficient, taxpayer-funded electric public streetcar systems in cities all across America.
And then they just dismantled them.
Exactly. They ripped up the tracks and burned the streetcars to force the American public into a state of car dependency. They forced the populace to buy private automobiles, buy gasoline, and buy tires.
And once the population is forced into cars, what does the state do? It taxes the commute.
Yep.
Riker points to modern examples like New York City's proposed $15 daily congestion pricing fee just to drive into Manhattan. Who does that hit hardest?
Well, it doesn't hit the hedge fund manager who can work remotely or expense the fee.
No. It disproportionately hits blue-collar men. Construction workers, plumbers, electricians' men carrying heavy tools who physically cannot take the subway and cannot work via Zoom.
It is a direct tax on male blue-collar labor just for the privilege of accessing the job site.
He also looks at the privatization of this infrastructure. Riker notes that BlackRock, a massive private equity firm, currently holds roughly $18 billion in toll road investments globally.
The extraction has been completely outsourced.
Right. Medieval peasants paid bridge tolls to the local lord in bags of eggs or grain. Modern men pay Wall Street firms with easy pass transponders.
It's exactly the same system.
Riker interviews a Texas long-haul trucker who calculated he was paying $8,000 a year just in highway tolls. The trucker realized that $8,000 was the exact cost of his daughter's state college tuition for a year.
Wow.
The quote from the trucker is devastating. They tax my diesel at the pump, they tax my income on the paycheck, and then they tax me again for using the road they already taxed me to build. The extraction is inescapable.
Which transitions us perfectly into the grand illusions of modern economics. We move from the taxation of the everyday commute into the systemic looting of national productivity.
Because Riker argues that the economic system is rigged at the absolute highest levels by a symbiotic relationship between crony capitalists and Marxists.
He views them not as opposites, but as two sides of the same extraction coin.
Yes, he takes aim at the robber barons first, completely dismantling the idea that early American capitalism was a free market.
He points out that while John D. Rockefeller was building the Standard Oil monopoly, his train cars full of oil barrels were rolling across state lines completely tax-free due to backroom deals with politicians.
Meanwhile, regular working-class mothers were paying heavy import duties on basic goods like baby carriages.
He provides the example of U.S. Steel in 1901. The corporation managed to pocket a $45 million tax rebate from the federal government.
$45 million in 1901.
Right. To understand the scale, that rebate represented roughly 8% of the entire federal budget at the time. And what did U.S. Steel do with that massive influx of taxpayer wealth? Did they innovate or raise wages?
I'm guessing no.
No, they immediately fired 20,000 workers to consolidate operations and boost stock prices. Riker says that wasn't free market capitalism, it was state-sponsored looting.
The government used its monopoly on force to extract wealth from the public and hand it directly to a corporate monopoly.
And here is where Riker's analysis becomes truly provocative and where his audience is going to lean in. He argues that state communism in the Soviet Union wasn't an alternative to this monopoly capitalism.
It wasn't a workers' revolution.
No, it was the exact same extraction mechanism, just rebranded as for the people. The Soviets, he argues, simply realized they could skip the middleman of the corporation and declare the workers' output as state property outright.
He uses the Stakhanovite miners in 1935 as the perfect illustration of this mechanism. Alexei Stakhanov was a Soviet miner who, under heavily staged conditions, supposedly mined an insane, record-breaking amount of coal in a single shift.
Right, he was rewarded with extra bread rations and treated as a national hero. The propaganda promised that if you worked harder, the state would reward you.
But the reality of the mechanism was a trap, like the margin call on labor.
Precisely. Once the state proved that a man could mine that much coal, they didn't reward everyone. They just raised the baseline quotas for the entire mine.
Unbelievable.
Men who were previously meeting their quotas early in the week suddenly found themselves working the rest of the week for free, just to avoid being sent to the gulag for falling short. The state absorbed all the surplus value of their labor.
Riker notes that by 1953, East German factories were legally required to send 89% of their total output straight into the state coffers. The worker was left with crumbs.
Riker views this as a modern illusion that we're still filing for today. He cites a 2023 study by the Cato Institute showing that 43% of millennials support the concept of state-managed labor, or socialism.
43%.
Yeah. Riker argues these generations have been tricked into rebranding historical serfdom as modern social justice. He takes Karl Marx's famous utopian phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, and reinterprets it.
How so?
He says that isn't a blueprint for utopia. It is the ultimate inescapable tax bracket. If the state determines your ability is high, they take everything. If the state determines your needs are low, you get nothing.
So what does this all mean for the listener? Riker argues that modern progressives and corporate elites use fair share rhetoric as camouflage for total societal control.
Exactly. Whether you call it capitalism or communism, the mathematical reality of wealth redistribution historically does not enrich the worker. It exclusively enriches the bureaucracy administering the redistribution.
Because to the guy on the factory floor or the guy driving the truck, the boot on his neck feels exactly the same, whether it has a corporate BlackRock logo stamped on the heel or a Soviet red star. It's all just extraction.
It's all the same.
Riker pulls from post-USSR archives that reveal 62% of Soviet taxes didn't go to breadlines or hospitals. They funded the expansion of the KGB's secret police and built luxury vacation dachas on the Black Sea for the party elites.
And Riker applies that same logic to today's corporate environment. He argues that modern ESG scores, environmental, social, and governance metrics, and carbon credits, are just the Soviet 5-year plan wearing a new corporate mask.
Wow, ESG is the 5-year plan.
It is an unelected bureaucracy dictating the terms of production and skimming off the top, punishing anyone who refuses to comply with the mandated ideology.
Which brings us to the most vital and actionable part of the entire book. We are not going to skim over this. Section 6 is literally titled The War Manual.
The War Manual.
Riker doesn't just write 500 pages diagnosing the disease. He provides a manual for escaping it. And he starts by looking backward, examining historical rebellions where men finally understood the math and said, enough.
He returns to the 1381 English Peasants' Revolt. This wasn't just a disorganized riot. In 1380, the Crown instituted a poll tax, a flat tax on every individual, regardless of income.
And the peasants marched on London.
Right, but Riker points out what they targeted. They didn't just march with signs demanding better treatment. They specifically targeted the Savoy Palace and the legal repositories.
The records.
They burned the marsh reeds, and crucially, they burned the copies of the Doomsday Records and the tax ledgers.
Right, because they understood the mechanism of their oppression. If you destroy the ledger, you reset the system. You can't tax a population if you don't know who they are or what they own.
We see the exact same targeted destruction at the 1244 Iceland Althing. The free farmers of Iceland realized that the increasing bureaucratic documentation was just a precursor to heavy taxation by the Norwegian crown.
So they physically torched the records office.
Yes, they burned it to the ground.
And his take on the Boston Tea Party is a massive paradigm shift. We are taught in grade school that American colonists dressed up and threw tea in the harbor because they were mad about a 3% tax on tea. No taxation without representation.
But Riker breaks down the actual economics. The colonists were furious because the British Crown passed the Tea Act, which granted a total legal monopoly to the East India Company.
A corporate crony.
It allowed this massive corporate crony of the state to bypass the usual colonial tax hurdles, letting them undercut all local colonial merchants.
The colonial merchants weren't just protesting a 3% tax, they were revolting against the loss of free market competition. They were protesting a system where the rules applied strictly to the working man, but were waived for the elite corporations intertwined with the government.
Exactly. Fast forward to 2018, and he looks at the French yellow vests. When the French government tried to impose massive new fuel taxes, disproportionately hurting rural workers who had to commute, the men didn't just stand in the streets of Paris singing songs.
No, they didn't.
They brought out heavy machinery and physically smashed the automated toll booths and traffic cameras that were bleeding commuters dry. They disabled the mechanism of extraction.
Riker studies these events and categorizes them into the 3 phases of revolt. Phase 1 is silent spreadsheets. This is the period we are arguably in now.
Explain what he means by that.
It's when men quietly sit at their kitchen tables, calculating their losses, looking at their pay stubs and alimony payments, and realizing the math of their lives mathematically no longer works.
Right, the silent realization.
Phase 2 is symbolic destruction. This is the burning of the tax forms, the smashing of the toll booths, the dumping of the tea. It is a physical manifestation of the broken social contract.
And phase 3.
Phase 3 is systemic collapse. Riker claims, citing historical data from collapsing empires, that a state is far more fragile than it appears. When just 3% of the male population actively resists and simply stops paying, the bureaucratic enforcement mechanisms are overwhelmed and the government falls.
But let's be real. Fighting the IRS or the federal government head-on today feels impossible. It's like bringing a knife to a drone fight.
Yeah, you can't just storm a castle and burn a paper ledger anymore. The ledger is decentralized, it's backed up in the cloud, it's tied to your social security number.
But Riker has a quote that provides the roadmap. Bureaucracy can't tax what it can't track.
Bureaucracy can't tax what it can't track. So how does the modern man actually opt out?
This is where Riker offers his specific modern war manual. He advocates for starving the beast by legally and technologically removing yourself from the grid of extraction. Let's start with the most extreme option he discusses, seasteading.
Walk us through how that actually works, because it sounds like science fiction.
It's based on international maritime law. Once you are 12 nautical miles off the coast of a nation, you are generally in international waters, free from direct taxation by a host country, though subject to the laws of the ship's flag.
Okay, so you build a city on the ocean.
Riker points to initiatives like the Floating City project near Tahiti.
Yeah.
He claims that for roughly $5 million, a collective can buy actual physical sovereignty.
Wow.
You build modular floating platforms that operate as independent micronations. You generate your own solar power, desalinate your own water, and route your commerce through decentralized networks. It is the ultimate physical exit from the state.
Okay, but most guys listening to this do not have $5 million to build a Waterworld fortress in Tahiti. What is the manual for the guy earning $80,000 a year who just wants to keep the fruits of his labor?
For those without millions, Riker advocates for digital escape. And the battleground here is currency. He warns heavily against the incoming central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
Right, CBDC.
A CBDC is not just digital money like a debit card. It is programmable money issued directly by the central bank. The state can attach conditions to a CBDC.
Conditions like what?
They can put an expiration date on your money to force you to spend it and stimulate the economy. They can program a currency so it cannot be spent on certain items like red meat or gasoline or ammunition if you exceed your state-allotted carbon footprint.
That is terrifying.
Riker views CBDCs as the ultimate, inescapable tool of state control.
The ultimate ledger, so how do you beat it?
You utilize Bitcoin and, crucially, cold wallets. A cold wallet is a physical piece of hardware, like a specialized USB drive, that stores your cryptocurrency offline.
So it's not on the internet.
Exactly. Unlike keeping your crypto on an exchange like Coinbase, which the government can subpoena or freeze, a cold wallet is entirely in your physical possession. If you convert your wealth into Bitcoin and store it on a cold wallet, the state cannot mathematically confiscate it without physically finding you and torturing the password out of you.
You have effectively taken your wealth off the grid.
He also tackles the massive drain to the healthcare system. Instead of pouring thousands of dollars a month into corporate health insurance pools, which he argues are just slush funds that subsidize the unhealthy lifestyles of others while denying your claims, he suggests utilizing health-sharing ministries.
The mechanism of a health-sharing ministry is fascinating. It operates completely outside the Affordable Care Act regulations. It is essentially a cooperative pool of like-minded individuals, usually with shared religious or ethical values, who agree to share each other's medical burdens.
Because they require members to adhere to certain lifestyle standards, like not smoking or abusing drugs, the risk pool is significantly healthier, and the monthly costs are a fraction of corporate insurance. You are bypassing the corporate-state alliance entirely.
And then there is geographic arbitrage, voting with your feet. The author points out the massive internal migration happening right now.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
Men are moving their businesses and their families out of high-tax jurisdictions like California and New York and moving to states with a 0% state income tax like Texas, Florida, or Tennessee.
Riker notes that Florida alone saw 1.2 million new residents recently, largely driven by men refusing to fund bureaucracies that openly despise them.
And for those who want to take it a step further, he outlines the mechanics of leveraging offshore entities. He explains how to set up an LLC in Nevis, a Caribbean island with incredibly strong asset protection laws.
Right, because if a family court or a predatory lawsuit tries to seize your assets, a Nevis LLC places those assets outside the jurisdiction of U.S. courts,
making it prohibitively expensive and legally complex for the state to reach them. He also details Puerto Rico's Act 22, which is now part of Act 60.
Explain how Act 60 works, because it's a massive loophole.
Under Act 60, if you physically move to Puerto Rico and become a bona fide resident, you can legally shield your capital gains from all U.S. federal income tax. You pay 0% on crypto gains, stock gains, and real estate appreciation.
Wow.
It was designed to bring high net worth individuals to the island, but Riker views it as a perfectly legal, state-sanctioned mechanism to starve the federal beast of your tax dollars while remaining a U.S. citizen.
If we distill Riker's ultimate thesis across all 500 pages, it comes down to a single, incredibly potent quote near the end of the book. He writes, "Rome fell because barbarians stopped paying taxes. Be the barbarian."
Be the barbarian.
Riker isn't advocating for standing in the street holding a cardboard protest sign. He views that as begging the master for a longer chain. He is advocating for starving the beast by building robust parallel systems.
You don't fight the matrix, you unplug from it. In his worldview, weakness gets taxed, strength escapes.
It is a philosophy of extreme self-reliance and technological evasion. He is asking men to become financially and geographically untrackable.
It is a relentless, heavy perspective on how the world operates, and after reading it, it leaves me with one final provocative thought.
Let's hear it.
Riker talks extensively about escaping the system through offshore accounts, cold wallets, and crypto. But as artificial intelligence gets exponentially better at tracking our digital exhaust, and as facial recognition cameras link our physical movements to these new programmable CBDCs,
Yeah, that's the scary part.
will the final frontier of tax evasion have to be entirely analog? Think about it. If they can track absolutely everything you do online, if every digital transaction is logged on a state-controlled blockchain, is the ultimate tax haven just, well, living completely off the grid in the woods?
That's a great question.
Are we going to see a return to an analog black market where men are trading physical silver coins for a dozen eggs just to keep the transaction off the digital ledger?
It is the ultimate question for the modern barbarian. We are entering an era of total digital surveillance. When the digital ledger becomes truly inescapable, the only freedom might be stepping entirely outside the machine, returning to the physical realities of barter and community trust.
Something to seriously mull over as the technology advances. Now, to our listeners, I want to remind you once again, we do not endorse these views, nor do we condemn them. Our job is to present the arguments.
That's right.
But Conrad Riker's ability to connect these historical dots, to explain the hidden mechanics of the systems we interact with every day, provides undeniable food for thought. If you want to dive into the deep end yourself and read the full war manual, you need to check out The History and Power of Taxation.
Highly recommend checking it out.
Go buy the ebook on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now. And make sure you follow at Conrad Riker at Substack to keep up with his latest writings. Finally, if you enjoyed this deep dive, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show so you can catch our next analysis. Until then, keep questioning the ledger.